please go and subscribe. You know, because I'm watching this. 7 reasons why vegans should focus on individual change. Let's find out, shall we? Shall we?
Unironically support a ban on meat eating.
There is no such thing as like consumer side activism. There is no like voting with your fucking dollar.
It means real change is being affected rather than some performative personal transformation.
Don't look at it on an individual scale. That's the problem. You can't look at things on an individual scale because individually we don't make that big of a difference, right?
Yikes. Yikes. Yes!
Individual change and systemic change aren't mutually exclusive. All right, so you personally going vegan and advocating for individual change doesn't preclude advocating for systemic change. In other words, you can do both. Now, you might point out that you can do both, but there's an opportunity cost. You can't do both equally well because the personal change reduces the resources, specifically time, you have to enact the systemic change. But I think this ends up being a pretty weak argument because the opportunity cost of going vegan is almost entirely front-loaded into the first month or two. After you figure out what to eat, where to eat, and how to make a few basic meals, purchasing and preparing plant-based foods takes no longer than purchasing and preparing non-plant-based foods.
Yeah, completely agree. And not only that, but actually sometimes it can be quicker. Because like, say for example, like Christmas dinner, like when people are waiting, like, I don't know how long anymore it takes, but you know, some people like cook up a goose, for example, which takes hours. And there I am for like 45 minutes with the freaking like vegan version. It's just so much quicker. It can well be. So I think it's even quicker. And yeah, you do have that initial month or two where you're kind of working things out, you're kind of looking at the ingredients list of stuff. Then after that, it's the only occasional time where you're like, oh, I better check if the ingredients have changed or something like that. Apart from that, literally no change. So yeah, it would be a really weak argument, but people do make it.
Picking up a carton of eggs or a bag of lentils takes the same amount of time. Ordering a bean burrito or a chicken burrito takes the same amount of time. Institutional change is made more viable and sticky by individual change. Do you think a society comprised of 3% vegans or 60% vegans has a better chance at passing laws to ban animal agriculture? What about a higher likelihood of actually...
That is what freaking annoys me. Okay, it's like all the people like, you can't make a change. Like, I would, but we can't make a change. Like, we need to change the system. It's like, yeah, exactly what Debug Your Brain's saying. Who do you think has a better chance of like smashing the subsidies, the lobbying? If you got 60% vegans in a given society, do you think that they're going to be able to pump subsidies into animal agriculture? Like, no way. No
Forcing
way.
the laws. What about a higher likelihood of black markets forming that circumvent the laws? Prohibition in the United States is the poster child for this problem. Prohibition refers to the banning on manufacture and sale of alcohol in the US from 1920 to 1933. And if you live in the US, you know how well that turned out. So why did it fail? Well, according to this Guardian article, Prohibition ultimately failed because at least half the adult population wanted to carry on drinking, or individual buy-in. Policing of the Volstead Act was riddled with contradictions, biases, and corruption, not enforced well, and the lack of a specific ban on consumption. Individual change wasn't legislated, hopelessly muddied the legal waters. The article even goes on to say there was a fatal flaw at the heart of the Volstead Act. It banned the manufacture, sale, and distribution of alcohol, but it did not outlaw consumption. In other words, even the law, itself a systemic element, targeted primarily more systemic level problems, like the manufacture, sale, and distribution. But it didn't target personal change or the individual's consumption of alcohol. And I know prohibition isn't a perfect analogy for veganism and animal agriculture, but that last point is particularly relevant to keep in mind, especially when we hear this rebuttal.
So around 48% of the general public would support a ban on factory farming, and then around 48% to 50% would support abolishing slaughterhouses. People will support us, but they won't change their individual behaviors, because in the same questionnaire, people were asked if whether they think eating animals is a personal choice, should be a personal choice, and the vast majority say yes.
And if you want another real-world example, listen to what David Rams has to say about banning beef in India.
India is a perfect example. It's where I am right now. They banned beef in most of the states here, and because the public was not on board, beef just became a black market item. So now, not only are they still killing animals and eating beef, they're doing it out of the government sight. So can you imagine how much worse that is for the animals? And obviously it was never better, but now it's about as bad as it could ever be because it's underground with no rules, no laws, and nothing.
All right, the next two reasons are going to involve just a little bit of math, but I promise it's worth it since I personally haven't seen anyone else raise these objections quite like this. Per capita matters. So I rarely see anyone bring this up, but it's relevant. Imagine I told you there were 10,000 murders last year in China and only 9,000 murders in Ireland. And then I said, I guess China's just more dangerous than Ireland. This would be patently misleading since China's population is so much larger than Ireland's. And therefore, we would expect significantly more murders. The more relevant question to ask would be, how many murders were there per capita or per person? How many murders were there when you adjust for the population size? Failing to account for this is one of the most well-recognized ways to lie with statistics, and I think we've lied to ourselves in a somewhat similar way when talking about individual versus systemic change. In other words, you can't look at the impact of an organization with 100,000 people and compare that to the impact of one person without adjusting for the 100,000 times multiplier of human time, human ingenuity, and human work. If you work at a drug company with 100,000 people and your new drug gets FDA approved, you don't get to take 100% of the credit for that. Roughly speaking, you get to take 1/100,000th of the credit for that. So let's try and get a rough estimate for individual and systemic impact per capita in a vegan context. Based on the numbers I've seen, you'll save somewhere between 32 to 582 animals per year by going vegan. The low-end estimate of 32 comes from the book Veganomics, and the high-end estimate of 582 comes from countinganimals.com. But there's other estimates like this analysis from Animal Charity Evaluator, which lands on 105 animals per year, while the vegan calculator says 365 animals per year. But we'll get back to those later. All right, so what about systemic changes? Well, let's take one of the poster children of systemic action. Petitions. According to this paper, the vast majority of petitions do not achieve any measure of success. Over 99% fail to get the 10,000 signatures required for an official response, and only 0.1% attain the 100,000 required for a parliamentary debate. So this means you'd have to sign 100 petitions just to get one official response, which of course isn't an actual institutional change. And you'd have to sign 1,000 petitions just to get a parliamentary debate in the UK. And again, a debate doesn't necessarily result in an institutional change.
No, it's very lip servicey to make us think that we've got some sort of say, but it doesn't really go anywhere. Why not when you just debate Bojo on the street? Hell yeah, let's go. Anyone want to see a Boris Johnson debate?
Change. Also, have you signed that many petitions this year? Has the person claiming it's all about institutional change signed that many petitions this year? Or in their entire life? All right, so back to per capita effect here. According to the same paper, in the UK, there were about 7 million signatures for about 20,000 petitions. That means on average, you need about 370,000 signatures just to get one petition up for parliamentary debate. And let's say that petition saved 100,000 animals per year. Per capita, that is, per person, you'd have saved about 1/4 of an animal per year. 1/4. That's 120 times less than even the lowest estimate for going vegan, which remember was roughly 32 animals per year. All right, but that's assuming each signature is an individual person. What if all those signatures were redundant? It was all the same people signing. You'd have 100,000 animals saved for 100,000 people contributing their signatures. Or 1 animal saved per person. Still 30 times less than the lowest estimate for going vegan. All right, but maybe the average petition saves more than 100,000 animals per year. Well, the second Google result for successful animal rights petitions takes us to a page titled 5 times a petition changed the world for abused animals.
Just debate him at wine parties around number 10. Hell yeah, let's go. I'm finding this really interesting. I don't know about you guys, but yeah, I've put the link in the chat description below. Please go over and, I'm not even done yet, right? This is rude, right? Salad behavior. He just has to get it. For the production alone, debug your brain must take a very long time. We appreciate. Hell yeah.
So let's look there and see how many animals were saved. Unfortunately, they only really give one numerical estimate for animals saved, and that's 100 bears on their number 2 spot. Not 100 bears per year. Just 100 bears. In other words, 1,000 times less than our hypothetical estimate of 100,000. But what about the top Google search result, 4Paws International? According to their 2021 recap video, they saved about 80,000 animals and 3 million people took action. So per capita, they saved about 3% of an animal. Not 3% of animals worldwide, 3% of one animal. That means going vegan saves over 1,000 more animals per capita. And remember, this is the website's own recap video, the one they're using for self-promotion, so it's very unlikely they were conservative with their estimates. But let's not count all the signatories. Let's just count the 670 team members for the Four Paws organization. What's the per capita then? About 121 animals saved per person. So more than the low-end individual estimate of 32, but still significantly less than the high-end estimate of 582. Alright, so I know some of you might be feeling a little angry right now. The tone of this video, the title, the content, seems like I'm shitting on Four Paws, animal rights petitions, and systemic change in general. But I promise I'm not. I totally think we should be signing these petitions, and I think what these organizations are doing is amazing. I also think we need to be enacting systemic change by way of laws and corporate policies, despite this video's slightly clickbaity title. My problem, however, is that the idea that we need to focus on systemic to the exclusion of individual change has found such purchase in the collective consciousness that to even suggest individual change is to expose yourself as some starry-eyed dreamer who's just too naive to understand how the world really works.
Get it?
It's everywhere.
Yes, get it. Roast them. Drag them by the throat, man. Love it. Oh, get it. Nah, I like this. I like the... He's right. I haven't seen it kind of broken down like that per capita. You know, so... You love it. Big fan. Big fan. Like this. This is a good video, I think, you know, to watch and share around. Please leave a comment. Let him know he's a salad. Yeah,
and it's not just veganism. So this video is an attempt at shoring up the case for individual rather than systemic change. And as such, I'm going to go pretty hard against systemic change, despite the fact that I think it's a completely necessary part of the solution, which I'll talk about more at the end of the video. Voting is a gamble with many layers of uncertainty. So voting is the other classic example of affecting systemic change. But before we talk about uncertainty, let's very quickly dip our toes back into the per capita argument. Let's say you're in the US and you vote for a politician who's going to enact vegan-friendly policies. They win and they actually successfully enact those policies. Let's even go wild and say those policies save 1 billion animals per year. What's the savings per capita? Well, in the last US election, Joe Biden won with about 81 million votes. So
this is the thing as well. It doesn't like, say for example, laws come in that are like, okay, we're now banning, you know, the use of animal products in food, in or any consumption of any kind. So that's brilliant. That would be amazing. But at the same time, it doesn't change the belief systems that people have surrounding animal rights. So when you are somebody who is vegan and you're boycotting these industries, typically that's coming with, you know, a philosophy that seeks to exclude, you know, the exploitation, cruelty to, and the killing of sentient beings. There's a why behind the vegan. There's not, you know, this, and if there isn't that kind of why driving people, it wouldn't be so difficult for it just to happen again. Or it wouldn't be so difficult for people to exploit animals of other species if there's no, you know, mentality behind it that would, what's the word? That would incentivize somebody to not involve themselves in such an action. So it is important that we are taking that individual action and we are educating people on the experience and the autonomy of sentient beings. So there's so many, because it's such a problem, because it's so massive, because anti-veganism or non-veganism is everywhere. It's rampant how much we exploit animals, mutilate them, kill them, violate their rights. It is everywhere. So just there's so much to do. Essentially, there's just too much to do. So there's a massive proportion that doesn't get solved if we just go, okay, well, now we're banning that. Because you just know that if there wasn't like a majority that were vegan, then it would be this kind of like, oh yeah, we're banning animal products because environmental law.
That gives us 12.3 animals saved per person. Again, just roughly a third of our low-end estimate of an individual going vegan. But it of course gets worse than that. Why? Because voting doesn't actually ensure that your candidate wins. It also doesn't ensure that they weren't lying about the policy, that they're competent enough to pass the policy, that the opposing party isn't competent enough to block the policy, that the law is actually enforced if passed, that it's not immediately repealed by the next administration, and on and on. But can we put a number on that uncertainty? Well, let's try a very, very rough method for doing so. But a real quick primer on probability. If I flip a coin, there's a 50% chance it comes up heads. If I flip 2 coins, there's a 25% chance they both come up heads. And we get that by multiplying the 2 probabilities together. So 50% times 50% is 25%. So let's say the probability of a favorable outcome for the 6 previously mentioned uncertainties is 50%. How likely is it our vote would even result in a given policy getting enacted? Well, we'd multiply the probabilities of those 6 events, which would give us a 1.6% chance of a successful policy being implemented, which, if you live in the US, probably sounds overly optimistic. So that's a 1.6% chance of your vote saving 12.3 animals per year. Or to put it another way, on average, your vote would save about 1/5 of an animal per year. Alright, probabilities obviously get more complex than that, but I just wanted to paint a general picture of the sort of uncertainty we're up against, and the ways in which uncertainties multiply even if we had a politician that campaigned on vegan-friendly policies. And I promise that's the last bit of math. Many systemic changes are more time-intensive and difficult to implement than individual changes. Alright, so you might be saying, well sure, just signing petitions or voting might not do much, but there's other ways to affect systemic change, like running for office or going to animal rights protests or organizing political pressure campaigns or starting a YouTube channel and spending hours upon hours researching, writing, and editing videos and interviewing people in the street for funsies. And it's true, you could do that. But speaking from experience, the individual act of going vegan is just orders of magnitude easier. The YouTuber Catherine Klein sums up the point nicely here.
Meaningful systemic change requires a lot of effort. It requires dedication and commitment and organization. It's much easier to simply avoid funding animal abuse than to volunteer your time and continue to show up for a sustained pressure campaign. Who are all these vegan allies willing to join us in this fight but unwilling to go vegan? These people who are supposedly pushing away by promoting veganism as a moral obligation. I don't know a single person who lacks the motivation to go vegan, but has the motivation to get involved in political work for farm animals.
We wouldn't apply this reasoning in other domains where oppression or suffering was taking place. For instance, imagine that I was racist, and every day I shouted a racial slur at someone on the street. Then you come up to me and explain the problems with racism. And I say, yeah, you know what, you're right, those are problems. But you can't really expect me to stop shouting racial slurs. I mean, we all know individual change doesn't make a difference. We really need to focus on systemic change. No one would accept that response from me. We do of course need to focus on systemic change when combating racism, but no one would let me off the hook there for my individual change, and no one would say it didn't make a difference. Now let me anticipate a common response here. The classic, are you comparing animals to people? Or are you comparing animal oppression to human oppression? And the answer in this case is not really. I'm testing the underlying principle and logic of we just need to focus on systemic, not individual change. The fact that this principle disintegrates so quickly when we apply it to other examples suggests the principle as such may not be a good one. Again, just imagine this applied to misogyny or xenophobia or not allowing certain people to vote or to people abusing cats and dogs. Systemic change is obviously an important part of addressing all those issues, but individual change also matters, and we wouldn't let individuals off the hook in those situations, even if we thought systemic—
It's the classic, as soon as veganism is brought up, the brain stops. It just stops. Like you just, pain. Okay,
change was a bigger piece of the solution. Individual change creates important personal psychological changes. Something that I don't think gets nearly enough attention is the internal psychological changes that occur when you stop consuming animal products. Or more specifically, I think the emotional change gets covered, but very little lip service is paid to the cognitive change. And if you're not vegan and don't know the emotional change I'm talking about, here's someone who's also not vegan, but I think is on their way, talking about how they felt after giving up meat.
Another thing I didn't predict about giving up meat
yeah, what's her name? Lena? I was supposed to upload a video, but it's been a while now, so, but yeah, we'll see.
How much calmer it made me feel. And I've talked before about how massive policy change, big systemic shifts are needed, but taking on individual changes and inconveniences can, one, change the conversation and the consumer demand with those of us able to do it, but also just internally align ourselves a little bit more. Like, again, I just felt like every time I ate meat, I was gaslighting myself because I knew what the truth was and I knew what was actually going on in the world. But every time I sat down for a meal, I was like, switch it off. You imagine that. You didn't need to that. No, that's not for you. And so living more in line with reality makes me feel better.
All right, so what about the cognitive change? I can only speak from personal experience here, but almost overnight, I became way more open to a bunch of other issues. Or more specifically, I became way more skeptical of the broad brushes and the negative stereotypes applied to activists in other domains.
Yeah, I found actually through veganism a lot about the way in which people debate and the thought processes that people go through. And I found out a lot about mine and like fallacies and, you know, the very fallacious reasoning. And it really helped me to navigate the world better and understand what I think is actually the case. So it's very helpful for understanding, you know, things logically, for having drawing better conclusions from other issues. So veganism's been really helpful in that, because I've seen how people just break down when it comes to something that they're uncomfortable with, and watching other people do that really helps me to understand when I do it. So, and I was just like, look, that annoys me so much when people do that, so I just don't want to do that myself.
Vegan activists had genuinely nuanced positions. They had responses to all the alleged arguments that vegans can't answer or vegans never thought about. They weren't just people who were overly emotional about some specific subject. And at least personally, this caused me to take a far more humble position on activists and causes I hadn't done any significant research on. And that in turn caused me to take a far more humble position on issues in general that I hadn't done any significant research on. Basically, it leveled up my epistemic humility. But there's another way it might also help you psychologically, which Charlie from the Charlie and Ben podcast describes here.
If you're unwilling to go through the experience of personal transformation and experiencing what that sacrifice feels like, you're unlikely to make long-term systemic changes that are effective, because you don't understand the challenges involved in getting from totally comfortable doing whatever I want to less comfortable living a more thoughtful life.
Now, I don't know if I fully agree with that, but I think it's at least something interesting to consider. And before I get on to my bonus reason and a brief word on systemic change, if you learned something new or this video caused you to look at this problem a different way, consider checking out my Patreon in the description and help me make this my full-time career.
Support
All right, bonus
the
reason
man.
time. Something that's always struck me about this individual versus systemic dichotomy is not just that you can do both, but that the borders between the two seem fuzzy at best. If you say, I'm not going to make an individual change, I'm just going to go to protest, you as an individual still had to make the individual decision to go to a protest. The same goes for signing petitions, voting, getting a job in a particular sector that benefits a cause, going undercover at farms, etc. You're still having to make individual changes to your life in order to try and affect systemic changes, and the causal flow works in reverse. If you make an individual change like going vegan, this slowly chips away at the economic demand for animal products. It sends social signals and creates social pressure for those around you, even if you're not one of those annoying.
Yeah, I think like I'm in the watch history. Get it? Not watch history. You know what I mean? Sidebar. No, it did make me realize as well when it comes to veganism that maybe I've got this wrong, but a lot of people aren't gonna do like good things unless they're actually pressured to do it. Like, I think it's maybe because of the way a lot of people are raised and they're not given a good upbringing and stuff like that, which is very common, that then people need some sort of like pressure applied to them to actually do the right thing. They won't actively do it by their own accord, which was a very concerning realization for me. But yeah, veganism really made me see that.
Preachy vegans. It introduces people in your social circle to new recipes and food items in general, which can create social ripple effects. The line between individual and systemic change is porous, with causes and effects flowing freely back and forth between them. So when someone gives you this line that we don't need to focus on individual change, drill down and see if they even know what it is they're claiming. Alright, so as I said, I'm not advocating against systemic change or petitions or voting. All these things have a place in ending animal oppression. I focused on national voting and national petitions, but there's also local political races and local petitions and e-petitions like change.org. Plus, voting or signing a petition generally doesn't take a ton of time, so they're not burdening you with some huge opportunity cost. Additionally, organizations like 4Paws saved around 80,000 dogs last year. For most people watching this channel, going vegan isn't going to save any dogs. You can also get involved in direct action, like going undercover at farms or through acts of civil disobedience. And it's undeniable that putting pressure on individuals with more influence will have a larger effect than putting pressure on a random accountant in Ohio. In other words, due to time and quantitative restraints, I only looked at a few forms of systemic action. Also,
yeah, and that's what Vosh was talking about in one of his videos about how he technically is a system because he has such a large influence. And that frustrated me because I was like, yeah, you do have a massive influence. So like you going vegan is even more imperative than it would be just as a, you know, an average Joe in your chat who nobody really knows. You have a massive, sway on what people do, on what they say, on what they think. So why not use that to go vegan?
So regardless of how many people are on board and go vegan, there absolutely need to be laws on the books officially codifying animal liberation. There has to be a psychological, a sociological, and a legal shift in the way we think about other sentient individuals. We need to end oppression wherever it rears its head, and it keeps rearing its head over and over in the exact same way. One group says another group doesn't count as someone, only something. We've been very slow to generalize this lesson, but we need to learn it once and for all, and not just for the animals. If we keep failing to get this right, then I pity the artificial intelligences and alien life forms we eventually come into contact with.
Yay! Go watch it on his channel. Go give it smash the like button, share it out.